let's see how we can create a form and then write code to validate the data that's submitted from that form on the back end or on the server side of our application. So we're going to do this within our Hello Flask app. So I'm just going to go there from my home directory, cd lc101 Hello Flask. And then as always, before we get started coding, we need to activate our virtual environment. So let's do source activate Hello Flask. All right, and we're ready to go. So I already have Visual Studio Code open here, and I've actually already dropped in a little bit of code. So if you're coding along, go ahead and pause the video now, and you can copy this into your main.py file. But basically what I've done is created a global variable called timeForm. Our form is going to allow the user to enter in a time, and then we're just going to validate whether or not that's a valid time. So we know that, there are only certain values that hours of the day or minutes of the hour can have, and we're going to validate the data that the user submits to make sure that when they give us a time, it's a valid time. So for this form, let's go ahead and look at what we've got here. I've got an H1 to specify or to indicate what the page is about, and then I've got a form that's going to post. I have a few inputs. My first input is named hours. That's going to be where we want the user to type in hours. We also have something called an hours error. So these are going to be placeholders, named placeholders for using string.format. So we're going to have a place to insert the hours as a value of the input. We're also going to have a place to insert the hours error within a p tag that goes right after that input. And that's where we're going to display error messages associated with that particular input. I have another label in input, and that corresponds to where the user will enter the minutes. And then finally, I have a submit button, and this says convert, but let's go ahead and say validate. Convert's not the right verb there. We'll say validate for our form. And I've also included just a quick style rule up at the top to say that anything with the class error on it should be displayed with red text. And notice that my p tags have class equals error. So that'll just be a nice visual indicator for the user to see that, when there's an error message, that it'll kind of jump out at them. Okay, so let's go ahead and set up a request handler to display this form. So I'm going to say def display time form, and I want to return. I basically want to return this form, and notice that I'm using this in two different ways. Kind of, I'm going to be using this form both for displaying the form initially, and it's also going to be where I display error messages after the user has submitted the form. So in terms of these placeholders, I'm going to need to provide sort of empty strings for these placeholders for the initial form submission, which is what I'm handling right here. So we'll say timeform.format, and then for each of these, I need to just add an empty string. Okay, and then I need to set up a route for that. So we'll say app.route, and we'll call it validate time. Need quotes. There we go. Okay, and that will display our form. Let's go ahead and test that out. Let's run our application. And it looks like I have a syntax error. I'm missing a comma right there. Okay. All right, and let's go in our browser to the URL for our form. There we go. So now we see we have a nicely formatted form, 2 inputs, and a submit button. All right, so now that we can display the form, let's write the code to process the form and then to validate it. So let's go ahead and make a new handler, def validate time. And I'll make this available at the same URL, app.route. And I want to make it available via post requests. So I say methods equal post. Okay, now within my form, we know that we need to the first thing we want to do is to get the data out of the request that the user submitted by submitting the form. So I know that I'm going to have two fields within my request that I can grab because I have two inputs. I have an input named named hours and an input named minutes. So let's go ahead and grab those. I can say hours equals request.form hours, and minutes equals request.form minutes. And just one note: this is of course the syntax we use to get the value of these fields off of the Flask request object, and we have to import that as well at the top of our file. So up at the top, I've imported from Flask imported request. So make sure you've got that import there if you don't already. Okay, so I have these two values, and then basically what I want to do is I want to check to see if these fall within the given ranges that hours and minutes can have. And if they don't, I want to go ahead and redisplay the form to the user with a helpful error message. If they do, I want to basically say, hey, that's a great time, success. Okay, so how are we going to validate these things? Well, a couple of things to note is when these inputs come in, or when these pieces of data are submitted via the form, they're going to come in as strings, right? So we know that we really want to think of these as integers, right? But they come in as strings. And so one of the things I need to do first is validate, is it a given, is the string able to be converted to an integer, okay? And so this is something that this requires a new piece of, say, technology, or a new piece of Python syntax that we haven't totally explored before, but you'll pick it up pretty quickly. So what I want to do is I want to validate whether or not hours and minutes are integers. And so I'm going to actually just write a validation function up above here. And I'm going to call def is integer. And that's going to take in a string and return true or false based on whether or not that string can be converted to an integer. And the way we do that is recall that if I were to say int num and to try to just convert that thing, that if it's convertible to an integer, that int function will return the integer value of that string. But if it doesn't, it will throw a value error. So basically what I want to do is I want to say, hey, does this call to the int function result in a value error? And I can do that using what's called the try except block. So I can put try, and that will try to run some code. And if the code succeeds, the function, the code that's within the try block will just go ahead and continue going, and it'll skip over the except block. However, if a value error happens within that try block, then whatever's in this block below will run. Okay, so if we try to convert the num string to an int and it works without throwing an error, then I know that I have an integer, right? However, if in this conversion on line 55, if that does result in a value error, then I know that I don't have an integer. I have something that does not properly convert to an integer. So using this try except, I can essentially test whether or not the string that's coming in the request is able to be converted to an integer, right? So if someone types, dog into our hours field, we'll be able to catch that using this function. Okay, so that's what I want to do first. Here I want to go ahead and say if not is integer hours. So in other words, I can't convert this thing to an integer properly. I know it's not even it's definitely not in the valid range if I can't even convert it to an integer. So I'm going to need to return some kind of error message. So let's create a couple of variables to hold our error messages. Okay, and we'll see why we create those up front in a minute. So if not is integer hours, if my hours value cannot be converted to an integer, let's go ahead and say hours error equals not a valid integer. And I can do the same thing with minutes. Okay, so in each case, I'm just checking to see whether or not those values that have been submitted can be properly converted to integers. All right. Great. So if they are able to be converted properly to integers, there's going to be another case that I need to handle, which is, are they in the right range? So I want to add else clauses to each of these too. So else if, let's say if, well, first I need to convert it, right? So I can say hours equals int hours, since I know that can be converted. And then I want to check and say if hours greater than 23, so we're going to be using a 24-hour clock validation here, or hours less than 0. So that's the valid range for an hour. It can be 0 to 23. And so if it's outside of that, I want to go ahead and set my error message accordingly. And say that that's out of range. And then I can do a similar thing down here with minutes. Convert it to an int, since we know we can safely do so after this checkup's up above. And then our valid range for minutes is 0 to 59. Great. All right, so what have we done so far? We've taken the values from the submitted form data. We've taken them out of the requests. And we've checked to see if each of those can be converted to an integer, since we want to treat it like an integer within our application. If not, we set an error message. If they can be converted to integers, we go ahead and do so, and then we check to see if they're within the valid range. So now what do we want to do, right? So there's two situations. Either our code has validated the submitted data and found that it's totally fine, that the submitted data is within the valid ranges and can be properly converted to integers, or we've not done so, right? So there's kind of two different cases that we have to treat now down below. So there are different ways you can approach this. The way I want to do it is to just say if not minutes error and not hours error. So these are strings, right? And if they are empty, that means that each of these checks worked out. I initialized these two variables to be empty strings, and if they remain empty down below, then that means I haven't found any errors, and so that's going to be the indicator to me in this particular case that I don't have any errors within that submitted data, and so not empty string will actually be true. So this statement will only evaluate the true as a whole if each of these strings is still empty. So basically what I want to do now is go ahead and do some sort of success message. We'll come back to this in a second. But first, I really want to test the validation part that catches errors. So if I don't have empty error messages, it means I must have an actual error, right? So let's go ahead and redisplay the form with the error messages. Okay. So I want to say timeform.format, and I want to return that. And then let's go ahead and figure out the right values to insert. So our form up above, it has these various placeholders. I've got hours, hours error, minutes, minutes error. Okay, so we know we can pass in the error messages. So let's go ahead and do that first. Let's pass in the error messages. Okay, but one more thing that I want to do is I've prepared these placeholders within the value attributes so that if one of the two does validate but the other doesn't, I can go ahead and leave that valid value in place so the user doesn't have to re-enter the valid value and they can only focus on the one that has a problem. So in order to do that, what I need to do down below is I need to go ahead and make sure I can go ahead and insert hours and minutes into this, but there's one catch. So let's go ahead and do this first. I'll say hours equals hours. That's going to insert into the placeholder hours, the variable value hours, and minutes equals minutes. So I can do this. However, if one of these is invalid, it will still have that invalid value in there. So I need to come up here, and if either of these doesn't actually validate, I want to go ahead and wipe it out. So let's say, in that case, I want to wipe it out, and then also in this case. So in this way, the invalid values will not be inserted back into the form. Okay, and let's actually go ahead and just put something quick in here, quick and dirty, so we can test our code. I just want to return just the word success. And we'll come back and add to that and make that a little bit better in a minute. All right, so this looks reasonable. Let's go ahead and run it and see how we do. All right, my form renders. That's good. Let's go ahead and give it a valid time. Okay, that seemed to work. Let's test an invalid time. So first, let me give it an invalid hours value. So the first check is whether or not this can be converted to an integer. So we'll give it something that's non-integral, not a valid integer. That's great. So what happened there was that, just to review, our this function tried to convert hours to an integer. It was not able to do that. So this returned false. This error message was set. And then down below, when I rendered the template, the error message, the hours error message, was rendered into the time form, which has this particular placeholder set up there for that message. Okay, so we know that that check doesn't work, or that check does work. It doesn't let through invalid integers. Let's check something that's out of range. So let's check like 24. Hour value out of range. That's good. Let's check a negative number. Again, that works. Great. So now let's do the same sort of checks on our minutes field. And then I'll do one more with, say, 70. Okay, so yeah, in general, this looks like it worked. So we've set up basic validation so that each of these form fields is then processed on the server side and validated before we really do anything with it, and we properly respond to the user with a helpful error message that's specific to the validation test that failed. Okay, so in just a moment, we're going to enhance this code and add a few things to it to just make this overall a little bit better and introduce a few new concepts.